Let's continue at the bottom of page 3 on the notes, and we'll look at the Satipatthana Sutta. So I put a note in here. I thought it was interesting that the Satipatthana Sutta is said to fulfill the 7 factors of enlightenment. So you could think of it as, again, we were talking about how important that the 7 factors are. You could think of the Satipatthana as one particular way of practicing now in order to fulfill it, bring those factors to culmination. That's right. So what I'd like to do is, I want to say just a little bit about, very, very brief, about what this sutta is. Some of you are very familiar with it. Some of you, I'm sure, are maybe not familiar at all, or just a little bit. This sutta in the Western Vipassana insight meditation scene is given, any of you who've been around a place like Spirit Rock or Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts, or any of the centers or groups that practice in those kind of traditions, you know that this sutta probably is foundational. And as we're going to see, there's a number of ways to practice according to this sutta. So what I'd like to do is just this is going to be so quick, don't try to remember this if you don't know what the sutta is, but I just want you to have heard the basics. So this is going to be about the 5-minute overview of what's in the sutta. If you don't know it, you'll stir your mind up and go crazy trying to memorize it. There's a good book that's recently out, just out, by Joseph Goldstein. The title is Mindfulness, and it's on this sutta, and it would be a good intro book. Probably the most accessible that I'm aware of if you want to approach this sutta. And I would say for any people who are serious meditators, this is a sutta that you would want to put some amount of reflection or study in, but you don't have to just throw yourself into it and memorize it and study it. You may want to put some intensive study, or you may just over time pick up pieces here and there. It's up to you. The main thing is, when we're actually meditating, you don't want to have to be thinking about the elements, because that can stir up the mind. And so if you're going to use this structure as part of your meditation, and you may or may not, the more fluent and familiar you are with it, then, right, it's just accessible. It's there for you. You don't have to think about it. Okay? So as you can see, it's called the 4 Foundations of Mindfulness. So what this sutta does is it's got 4 sections, and it's 4 different aspects or ways to apply mindfulness. So let me just name what they are. The first section is mindfulness of the body. And that section is divided into 6 parts. You can see already that there's a lot of complexity here. I'll just name what they are. Again, if you don't know, don't try to memorize it, or don't worry. But the 6 parts are, there's mindfulness of breathing, which it's divided into 4 parts. We're actually going to look at that, but it just goes on and on, the divisions. So the first section, mindfulness of breathing. Then there's what's called the 4 postures. So you can be mindful when you're sitting, standing, walking, lying down. Third is mindfulness in all activities, where you're moving about, using the toilet, bathing, eating, just in any activities you can be mindful. Those 3. Those are the 3 that are most commonly talked about in the ways that meditation, that I hear it talked about. But let me name what the other 3 are. There's what's called, I might be getting the order wrong here, but 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And basically, we won't go into detail, but that's a way in which it's another way to hold any experience. So if you close your eyes and you drop below the verbal conceptual level and just to the raw experiential level of any experience, for example, I'm sitting in this chair, I can feel the pressure of my bottom on the chair. That's a solidity, that's an earth element, for example. Breathing is air element. Temperature, we're all dealing with that today, even if it's warm or cold, but that would be fire element. So on. Liquid, there's liquid in your mouth, whatever. So you can experience everything just in terms of 4 elements. We won't go into any detail. This whole practice is laid out on how to do that. Then there's another section which is called the parts of the body. And it divides the body in the suttas. There's 31. Visuddhimagga has got 32. But it starts off head hair, body hair, nails, teeth, skin, and it's a way you can actually contemplate the body in terms of its parts, bones and so on. And we won't get into the discussion on, well, why would someone want to do these different kind of practices? What would be the benefit of just purposely going through a list of 31 or 32 parts in the body and just trying to feel into the body in that way? Or to just feel every moment by moment in terms of the 4 elements. These are all, major styles of practice, and for each of these, there are whole schools of practice dedicated to these. But in the service of the Samadhi, we're just naming them. You can go into Joseph's book or go online. You can just find so much on this sutta, and you can explore that more for yourself. Okay, let's see. Breathing, 4 postures, all activities, 4 elements, 31, or Visuddhimagga, 32 parts of the body. And the 6th are a list of, I think it's 9 what are called charnel ground contemplations. And it's where you need to have access to a decaying corpse, and you actually sit with it, and then it names all these different stages of decay. And so that would be a whole nother type of meditation. And again, the question might be, why would someone, what's the benefits of doing that? So that's the first contemplation on mindfulness of the body. It's in 6 different parts. The second section is what's called, so hi, welcome. We're just on, really on the top of page 4 in your notes, bottom of page 3 and page 4, we're starting to look at Samadhi in the Satipatthana Sutta. And I'm just giving a very, very high-level overview of what's the sutta. The second section, and in case, since I don't know you guys, if you don't know about the sutta, I mentioned Jack Kornfield's, Joseph Goldstein's book that's just come out titled Mindfulness, which would be a good intro to, and very in-depth, thorough intro if you don't know the Satipatthana Sutta. Second section is called Vedana, which is translated as feeling tone. But it's not feelings in the ordinary usage. For many of us, when we say feelings, we mean moods or emotions. It's something different. It's saying that every experience is either a pleasant experience, an unpleasant experience, or it's called neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Sometimes for shorthand, people call that neutral. But neutral's can be a tricky term because it can have the connotation of you're numbed out or something. It just means you can have experiences and they're not particularly pleasant or unpleasant. That's what, okay? And so it's specifically looking at that aspect, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The third contemplation is what's called a contemplation of mind. The word in Pali, chittas, means mind. And there's a specific list. It's not talking about consciousness, it's actually talking about states of mind. So for example, it's not that long of a list, but you're mindful of if greed, hatred, or delusion are present in the mind, and you're aware and mindful if they're absent in the mind. So that's more of a coloring of your perception or states of mind. You know, is the mind concentrated or not? There's concentration right there. Actually, the word is not, it's actually not concentration there because we're using the word Samadhi. Here it's Samadhi tam, which just means having attained concentration. It's not actually talking about it's not explicitly naming any particular level of concentration, but you know, has the mind attained concentration to some level or not? And there's some other, is the mind contracted? You want to know if it's contracted or not. Is it liberated? It just goes through a list of qualities or states of mind. So that's the third foundation. And then the fourth foundation gets back to what we mentioned earlier in the last session, Damas, when I said things and then I changed it to be phenomena. And the fourth foundation is mindfulness of Damas. And again, this is, you'll see how the level of complexity starts going up rapidly because it now contains 5, let's see. So in there's contemplation of some more lists. And I'll just name them. This isn't to scare you about how complex it is, but we just wanted to at least name it. 5 hindrances. Don't worry if you don't know the contents of these lists. And again, we're not going to get into it here. Go to get Joseph's book. 5 hindrances, 5 aggregates, 6 sense, what's called 6 sense, we'll just call it 6 senses, 6 sense bases, 7 factors of enlightenment, right there, and the 4 noble truths. But it's asking us in the fourth foundation to be mindful of specific things in relationship about those foundations, not just being aware of them. So for example, for the 5 hindrances, for each of them, we're mindful of when the hindrance is present or not, but we're also mindful, we're aware of what is it that causes a hindrance to arise and what is it that prevents it from arising. With the 6 senses, and by the way, you might be wondering why 6, because aren't there 5 senses? Seeing, hearing, tasting, touch, which is body sensations. Seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touch. The 6th is called the mind, because it's considered a sense door, because it's another way we can have experience, mental experience. So in this model, it's a 6th, not 6th sense like psychic, but a 6th sense in just the ordinary sense.
They just simply say thank you.
It's called the mind door, not just thoughts, because there's a lot that can go on in the mind besides thoughts.
So emotions would fall in that?
It's everything else, anything in the realm of mental. Sankharas is, anyway, which we'll talk about in a bit. Right? But it's not only being mindful, like when you're seeing that you're seeing, or when there's a body sensation, being mindful of a body sensation, but you want to know, they use the term fetter. What's the fetter that arises with each? In other words, this is a perfect example, like when Richard was talking earlier, which is very important, talking about, that was actually a deep question about, can get into this samadhi, but also there could be irritation around sound, right? We can all have versions of relating to that. There is a fetter, there was something about sound, that's one of the sense doors, and the mind would get hooked into some kind of suffering. We call it a fetter. You would want to know, oh, when I hear that sound, some coming in, some suffering or contraction or something happens. Why would we want to know that? So we could work with it, learn to work with it skillfully and whatever we need to do to work with it. And so on with the 7 factors of enlightenment. We not only want to be aware of when they're present or not, but we want to be mindful of what brings them to their fruition. And you also want to know directly the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 noble truths. All right, so that was a quick whirlwind. Just, we're up at, that's the 35,000 foot view of the four foundations of mindfulness. There's more in there actually than that, because for each of the foundations it talks about different ways to approach it. It could be experienced internally and externally, and both internally and externally, and there's more instructions that are given. But just to know that those are the basic foundation, the basic practices. All right.
And the 5 aggregates.
5 aggregates, yeah, is there.
Which one? What are they?
I don't want to get into the list of what the 5 aggregates are. I'm happy to talk to you offline. But right, because we're going to know some of these lists you might not know. So again, come see me afterwards, and I'll tell you what it is. It was a perfectly fine question. I just kind of didn't want to spend the time. So this sutta actually appears in 2 places. It appears in the Middle Length Discourses, and I say that there in your notes at the top of page 4, as the Satipatthana Sutta. And it appears again in another collection of suttas called the Long Discourses, and it's called the Great Maha Satipatthana Sutta, and it's identical word for word to the other version, except at the end, that section on the 4 Noble Truths, they expand it, and so the whole Eightfold Path is expanded out in detail. Okay. So that's going to be interesting for a particular reason to know these 2 versions. Okay. All right. So now we've got this important. Basically think of it as meditation practice instructions. Not the only way to practice. There's a path of jhana, there's this Anapanasati Sutta, but it's important, right? All right. So, the only other thing I want to point out, you can put in as much, read over more of page 4 of your notes, but I do want to point out one important point. The Satipatthana Sutta is not, I think it's pretty clear that it's not asking us just to have a bare mindful knowing of what's happening, which is a common, this is my take on it. I don't mean to say anybody else is wrong. Because you'll hear mindfulness, somebody asked me earlier, what's my definition of mindfulness? And I gave a definition of the state of mindfulness as not being on automatic pilot. There's actually, how do we define the practice of mindfulness? And it's talked about in a lot of different ways. One of the most common ways is just a non-interfering presence. Nothing to do, but it's just a bare knowing. As far as I can see, in the Satipatthana Sutta, it's asking us to be quite engaged. You are contemplating in particular ways. I very briefly mentioned that it will say you contemplate these experiences internally and externally, and there's other ways that I'm just not taking the time to go into. I won't even say what does that mean to do it internally and externally. In the 4th foundation on Damas, for example, in the 6 senses, it's not just asking us to have a bare awareness of, say, sound, but to know the fetter that arises with each. And it's not so you can just sit there and be aware so that you can continue to get irritated every time you hear a sound, but not do anything with that information, right? It's a liberation practice. It's asking us to be involved. So we bring the knowing, what's called, there's these 2 phrases used together, what's called mindfulness and what's often translated as clear comprehension. 2 different words, but they're close, but they're not the same. The mindfulness is just not being spaced out, not being on automatic pilot, you're present. And then through that, we can have a real clear knowing of what's happening in the moment. So that's the sampajanya that you were asking about. Mindfulness and clear comprehension really go together. And then it's through that clarity that we can really know when we're resting in the stream of non-clinging, or when there's some suffering and we come to know what's the way to let go of my suffering. So there's more to do than just bare awareness. So if you would turn, let me pause for a moment. So I realize I'm just kind of shooting that at you rapid fire. And again, as I was talking about earlier, that this sutta deserves a lifetime of practice and a lifetime of reflection and study. I don't want to get too much into it, but anything, I'm not going to let this go too long because we want to look at Samadhi now, but is that okay, or was it more confusing? Was it enough just for the high level, just acknowledging what it is? Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
A real specific question about on page 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs up. To train experiencing the whole body and tranquilizing the body formation,
Yeah.
pointing towards an engaged role in the practice.
Right.
Tranquilizing the body formation, what does that mean?
It's calming the body.
Oh, just calming it down.
Right. Yeah. So let's look on page 5. Samadhi is directly mentioned in the Satipatthana Sutta in only 3 places. And I've listed them here. Remember, I said in the 3rd foundation, it's you know if greed, hatred, and delusion are present or if they're absent in the mind. And it also wants to know if the mind's concentrated or not. So that's one place. It's not telling you to get any kind of concentration. It just wants to know how is the mind? Is it scattered? Is it concentrated? And actually I did write it here. The Pali term is there, samahitam, which means having attained samadhi. You want to know if the mind has attained samadhi or not. So that's the first place.
I'm sorry, Richard. In this case, when they're talking about samadhi, they're talking about jhana?
Well, that's interesting. Here's what I said at the bottom of number 1 there. You can just follow along up on page 5. We might suppose that samahitam refers to having attained jhana, since the Satipatthana practices are the path leading to the fulfillment of the 7 factors of enlightenment. And I was arguing that the fulfillment of the 7 factors of enlightenment equates to the fulfillment of jhana. It doesn't say that explicitly in here. So you could say, well, okay, you can say that, but you don't have to say that. There's a lot of other possible interpretations, because I'm taking, but there's no question that, so you could easily come to that conclusion if you're predisposed to do that, as I tend to be. But the other thing I say here, in any case, the suttas probably are not interested in having the meditator develop anything other than right samadhi. So I would say here it's not telling you to develop it, but it wants to know if you have attained samadhi. So is it saying have attained right samadhi or not? I don't know. So you can't really say if it's jhana or not. But I think it would be a mistake, as I'm going to argue here, to go all the way on the side that the Satipatthana Sutta, as it's sometimes talked about, is not particularly interested in samadhi. We'll come back about that. I think that's, I would say, taking it too far. But just because I say it doesn't make it true. But we'll come back and look at that exact question in a moment. Second place the samadhi is mentioned is in the 4th foundation of mindfulness, on mindfulness of Damas. And as I said, one of the 5 lists in there is the 7 factors of enlightenment. And samadhi is one of the factors, so it's explicitly in there. Okay. And in fact, here's I gave you the quote right here. If the concentration, this is right out of the sutta, if the concentration, that's samadhi, enlightenment factor is present in him, he knows there is the concentration enlightenment factor in me. If the concentration enlightenment factor is not present in him, he knows there is no concentration enlightenment factor in me. He knows how the unarisen concentration enlightenment factor can arise, can be made to arise, and how the arisen the concentration enlightenment factor can be perfected by development. There's nothing explicit about jhana, but what would be perfecting that? I think you have to say it would be jhana. But it doesn't say that explicitly, so there's room to go either way, but it seems like a slam dunk to me. All right. The third place where samadhi is discussed shows up in the Maha version, the version that goes into the detail of the whole Eightfold Path. And in that version, as appears in other places, it's a place that's explicit, as we were talking about earlier, that jhana, that right concentration of the Eightfold Path is the four jhanas. And it goes into, and let's just read this quote here on how they talk about it. Towards the bottom of page 5. The instruction is to, quote, know as it really is, this, which the Noble Eightfold Path, is the way of practice leading to the cessation of suffering, which is, and then it goes through the list of each, right view all the way to right concentration. And then it says, and what is right concentration? And then it starts right there, and it just lays out the whole definition of the four jhanas. So you can say that, so it's in there. You could say, it doesn't say you have to have jhana. It could be that it's just pointing out that right concentration is the four jhanas, but it's not particularly trying to get you to have right concentration, right? It doesn't seem that way to me. And by the way, none of this is right or wrong as put into practice, because we know, remember back, I think it was our very first day together, we were talking about the different paths in the Visuddhimagga and in the suttas, and that people seem to come to tremendous great depths of, get tremendous benefit and fruit, and you could say their enlightenment or depths of awakening, practicing in all these different styles. So we know that, and there's these great masters practicing in all these different styles, so we know that in practice we can't say, you've got to have jhana, and we also can't say, oh, better not talk about jhana. You know, none of those can be categorical statements true for everyone. It's a question of finding which style of practice best suits each of us. That's the key, okay? But I do want to point out a few more quotes. We won't go through everything here. Let me pull a few more out. On page 6, and at the top here I say, based on the sutta itself, we cannot determine what level of samadhi the sutta wants us to develop. For that, we have to look elsewhere. So I've got a few other places from the suttas that will inform how one might view this sutta. But even that it has its difficulties, potential problems. I'm making an assumption that I'm making a choice here to approach the suttas as a cogent or kind of unified collection body of work. Right? There are places in the suttas that don't always line up, that don't necessarily match up so well. And you could throw your hands up and say, well, over the centuries, between the time of the First Great Council, we were talking earlier, and when they were written down, so much other stuff got put in that we've just got kind of a mess on your hands. And it's just not, different voices got put in, and we've got, it's, the suttas are contradicting each other and they don't line up. And that's maybe historically, in fact, what happened. But we don't know. But in any case, what we have is the suttas. And I've chosen to approach the suttas as letting the whole body of work, everything inform everything else as much as we can. I find that a much more useful way to practice. Right? So that if not something tucked away in some corner, mentioning something once in the suttas is enough to give it canonical authority. No question. But some things are kind of tucked away and you have to wonder, well, it's kind of this, it's obscure and where'd that come from? And at least it feels a little easier maybe to not put too much weight on it. But there's some main things that are repeated over and over, and they're not just tucked off in some little corner. And so the tradition, at least, whether it came in later or the Buddha actually said it, the tradition is holding this up. This system of practice is holding this up as important. So we're trying to take a bunch of these, a range of these important main pieces, mainstream aspects, and see how they inform each other. So it's just a choice. I'm just bringing this up because you can see it may actually not be historically accurate. The question is, how do we hold all these teachings that can make the most sense for us? Yeah? Okay with that? All right. So let's look at a few things. So let's just go through some of these here on 6. First, and again, I'm reading them out. You can read them, but to get them on the video. The first practice of the sutta, which is breath meditation, is presented in 4 steps, beginning with bare awareness to understand when breathing in and out long and breathing in and out short in the first 2 steps. You're just aware of your breath, whether it's long or short, in and out. And then as your concentration strengthens, in the 3rd step, you experience your whole body. That's what it says. The word in Pali is sabakaya, whole body. That's a degree of settledness in the mind, and the awareness goes and expands to the whole body. And in the 4th, it tranquilizes the bodily formation. Someone was asking about what's the bodily formation, yeah? The bodily formation is defined in some of these other suttas as in-breathing and out-breathing. So tranquilizing the bodily formation is sometimes viewed as the whole experience of your whole body, sometimes viewed as tranquilizing your breath. So it's either a practice of calming the whole breath or calming the whole body. That certainly entails some degree of samadhi. Let's just put it that way. It doesn't say jhana, but there's some concentration there. There's just no doubt about that. Also, we've already talked earlier about, when we looked at the 7 factors of enlightenment, that I was mapping those factors onto jhana. Yeah, that's what we were doing. Certainly, if you take the 7 factors to culmination, you're talking about jhana. And we talked about how, remember that was that phrase, that passage that said, anybody who's ever been enlightened in the past or is now or will in the future did so by, they set aside the hindrances. They practiced the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and they brought the 7 factors of enlightenment to fruition. You could look at the practice of Satipatthana, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, as a practice to bring the 7 factors of enlightenment to culmination. And if you want to equate that with jhana, you could actually say that 4 foundations of mindfulness is intended to be the practice to develop jhana. That's a controversial statement, by the way. But listen to this. It gets worse, or better, depending on what you... In the middle of page 6, we see where there's that bold text. This is from the Samyutta Nikaya. It says, when engaged in only the second half of the sentence is the quote, but it's clear. It says, when you're engaged in the 4 foundations of mindfulness contemplations, if the mind does not become concentrated, the defilements are not abandoned, the mind does not pick up the sign, this is the word nimitta of concentration, and the meditator, quote, does not gain pleasant dwelling in the present life, nor does one gain mindfulness and clear comprehension. So it's explicit that some level of samadhi is intended. And then I have two more pieces here that I think get kind of interesting. I think, by the way, in case you haven't noticed, I've tried to come into this series without my own agenda. I'm not saying I don't have an agenda, okay? But I try to set that aside because we just want to look dispassionately at the range of teachings and how they're applied so we can find what works best for us. And we're being respectful of all these different paths, right? Well, now I seem to be pushing I am. I just want to name it. That now there's a little agenda coming in that's saying whether we practice in that way or not, when I read the suttas, it seems to me that it's emphasizing the samadhi more than often gets emphasized here. Look at this other sutta here. This is from the Middle Length Discourses, sutta number 117. In one of right view, right intention comes into being. In one of right intention, right speech comes into being. In other words, it's working step by step. When you've got the first, each step of the Eightfold Path is a precursor and leads to the next. In one of right mindfulness, which is defined, the suttas define right mindfulness as the four foundations of mindfulness. That's defined in another place, but it's explicit. So it's basically saying one practicing or has developed the four foundations of mindfulness, right concentration, which is the jhana, comes into being. That's I don't think it could be any clearer. Every time the suttas say right concentration, you can just substitute in jhana because it's already said explicitly that that's what it is. So I use those terms, you should be using them interchangeably. I mean, that's what the suttas are saying. Suddhimagga is not saying that, but remember, that's a different system. The commentaries are a different system than the suttas. Another controversial statement. That statement shouldn't be controversial because it's just clear that they're two different systems, yeah. This is going up on the internet, by the way. Let them criticize that statement. What are they going to say? Yeah?
Well, I think they're going to say something about the goal of insight into the true nature of reality being an essential component of enlightenment.
Right.
And therefore, the text, the Satipatthana, points as much, if not more, to that.
Right.
That everybody says you need both.
Right, yeah. Right, again, this is something we've been through in the previous sessions, but in all the systems, insight is in service of the liberation. That's what's important. Samadhi is a support for that. But when you look in the suttas, and again, next month, and then we'll really go into these exact controversies now in detail. But basically, as far as I can see, the suttas are saying that the insight comes. You're not out of jhana when you're doing it. It's actually insights that come while in jhana, because it's a different jhana system. But we've been through that, and I don't want to get too off into that. Yeah.
I'm not sure the interviews in your book, but there was one where the fellow said that maybe it was Lee, I don't know. He said that you get the insights when you come out of jhana. It's like when you're in the deep states, you're wherever you are. But when you come out and the mind kicks in again, is then when the insights form.
Yeah.
And that intuitively kind of seems to make sense, just knowing what the experience of living is. But my question is that in line with what you're saying here?
Well, so this is getting into. So what we're going to do, I'm going to answer your question in a moment, but let me just say, so here's what's going to happen. I meant to mention this earlier. So we've got 2 more day-longs after today. So the last one in February, then that's the one where I've invited half of the day. Lee Brasington's going to come. So I'm not teaching, I'm going to be here sort of just facilitating, but Lee is going to take, I forgot whether it's the morning or afternoon, and Lee Brasington's coming, going to do, I don't know how much he'll do practice teaching, he's going to do his thing half the day. And Tina Rasmussen and Stephen Schneider, who teach in the Powwock style, are going to come and take half a day. Because, you know, you're hearing me, but we should hear what some other voices say too. So that's going to be an interesting day. So that's in 2 months. 1 month from now, then, since we'll have all this background, we're actually going to take the day and then look in detail at what are considered the controversies. We're going to go back now and say, okay, what's jhana? We've actually already answered that, but we're going to really look at in detail at the controversies. How people can, like, how is it that we already posed the question, how can the Visuddhimagga, how do they justify saying that there's no body awareness in jhana when it's explicit and it's just all throughout the suttas? How do they do it? So we'll look and see what they say. Again, we're not judging them, we're just going to look, we'll do into that. We're going to look at this exact question around insights. We're looking at the texts. What do they say? How does insight arise? Is it something that's not, how does it relate to samadhi in particular? Is it something that happens within a state of jhana? The Visuddhimagga, we already know, is saying, no, that's not where it happens. What are the suttas saying? And we're going to look at a range. So we're going to go into all these questions in detail next month. And some other questions. Do the texts, we know the Visuddhimagga does not require jhana for liberation because there's the path of vipassana, which is not the path of, there's no jhana. What do the suttas require jhana or not? We're going to go look and see what the texts say in detail with all of that. So maybe for now, we can set this insight question aside, since this is exactly what we're going to spend a lot of time just on that one question. What's insight, and what are the range of ways the texts talk about it in relationship to samadhi? And it turns out it's not just one answer. That's why there's that's why there's so many different ways people can actually practice. And of course, the good news that we've repeated about that is then that we don't have to make anybody right or wrong. We can just look at the range and see what's the best fit. But getting back to this, all I know is that when I read this sutta, I'm just going by what the Buddha said, you know. And he said in one of right mindfulness, in other words, one of practice of four foundation mindfulness, right concentration comes into being. It doesn't say that's the only way. But that's explicit. And there's the quote for you. Look for yourself, Majjhima Nikaya 117, paragraph 34. There it is. Here's another one that's interesting underneath that from Middle Link Discourses, Sutta 44. It says, what is concentration and what is the basis of concentration? That word basis, by the way, is nimitta. Remember we talked about in the Visuddhimagga, nimitta was a particular sign that you got as you got more concentrated. It could be like a round disk of light or other nimittas. In the suttas, remember I'd said that the term nimitta doesn't mean that. It meant the theme or a basis for something. It has different meanings. So this is it. What is concentration? What is the basis of concentration? Unification of mind is concentration. It doesn't say jhana, but you know, it doesn't say right concentration either, but you know, you're pretty concentrated. Unification of mind, let's just leave it at that. The four foundations of mindfulness are the basis of concentration upon which it's based. Yeah. So it looks to me like it's certainly a strong link to the samadhi that's in the suttas. Again, we've set aside the Visuddhimagga for the moment. And there's one more here. Well, I'll let you go through the top of page 7 and all that on your own. But there's more quotes that even more connect them together. And so what I want to do is then at the bottom of page 7 and to the top of page 8, I've listed some different ways on how you could work with the 4 foundations of mindfulness in practice. And I've just picked some of the common ways that I know of it's taught. But this isn't meant to be an exhaustive or, complete list of all the possibilities. So let's just look at it quickly here. And I'm doing this because I think you'll see in a moment, I think this comes back and connects it with Samadhi. So one way that's probably one of the most common ways I hear the Satipatthana Sutta put into practice is, if you go on a typical retreat, at least here in the West, they may start off and just give you instructions for the first maybe few days to just practice mindfulness of breathing. They're taking the very first practice in the first contemplation on mindfulness of the body, and you just do that. And then over time, they may open it up so that you start to become more aware of consciously being more aware of, they'll emphasize being more mindful when you're moving around all activities. As your mind gets more settled and you're open to more subtlety, then you can start to maybe notice the Vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, and what that does. So they may give you instructions now to open your awareness to that. Open your awareness to more experiences in your whole body. Then maybe in another day or two, things get more subtle now. Maybe you're able to detect what's happening in your mind more naturally and easily. And so you'll be aware of states of your mind and so on. And so they work systematically through the sutta. They won't do everything. They're probably not doing a decaying corpse contemplation. They may not bring in 32 parts of the body or 4 elements, for example. Those tend to be set aside as specialized retreats. By the way, if you're interested in a 32 parts of the body retreat, I'll be co-teaching one at Spirit Rock in September. Do one with Bob Stahl and others. So, it's just different. What's that?
When is that?
I think it's in September. And yes, do you know? And Mary Grace Orr. If you don't, I don't know if you know. You may not know her, but anyway, It's not important. I thought you knew her. That's all. I don't know why I thought that. So, but they work systematically, and then depending on the particular teacher, they may teach in a way that says, still give a certain amount of emphasis to mindfulness of breathing, but if something else comes up that's strong and compelling, let go of the breath and put your attention to this other experience. And then when it settles out, come back to your breath. That's one way it can be taught. Other teachers might say after you've settled down for a few days, you don't give any particular preference to breathing. It's just whatever's prominent in your awareness out of any of these foundations of mindfulness moment to moment. And just be mindful in that way. So different ways it's taught. So that's one way. Another way that it's taught is some teachers will put emphasis just on one of these foundations. So there are some teachers for whom mindfulness of the body is really what they're emphasizing. And of course, when hindrances or other things are up, they will want you to be mindful of that, but it's mostly a mindfulness of the body practice. Other teachers, like U Tejaniya is one who's been kind of on the scene in recent years. He's popular with some people. And it's really the third foundation. It's mindfulness of mind states. And that's really seems to be what he most all cares about. And if you go do retreats with him, he's just putting all the emphasis on that, not even trying to particularly get you concentrated. As far as I can tell, he's just not that interested in that. He just wants you to be aware of, as best you can, what's going on in the mind. And so on, you could pick particular pieces, and that could be your whole emphasis. That's another way to do it. And then again, I've listed that okay, anyway, that's the main ways where So everything I've just talked about is an example of that the Satipatthana Sutta is viewed as being prescriptive. It's prescribing what to do. There's another way, this last way happens to be the way that I teach more, which is rather than the sutta being viewed as being prescriptive, I view it as being descriptive. That it describes what happens just by undertaking the first practice of mindfulness of breathing. And in that understanding, what happens is by giving some emphasis to mind. So the way we've been teaching here and so far is you give emphasis to some primary practice, whatever it is, right? Doesn't have to be breathing, but and you give it a pretty strong emphasis. And by doing that, giving it that strong emphasis, it supports the deepening of the concentration side. And then we've been saying two things. One is that on its own, you'll have lots of times when you can't concentrate, or other things are up, and you just find yourself on the insight. You didn't have to choose to turn to insight. You're just on the insight side of the practice, because what's going on now is not trying to stay with the breath, but you need to deal with letting go of your suffering, or working with this pain or this emotion. And so you're just naturally on the insight side. And then that'll settle out. You'll be able to concentrate. You're just back with your breath. You're just back on the concentration side. And then you just stay with that and take it as far as you want. And by doing that, you're just doing one thing, mindfulness of breathing, and staying attuned to what happens in moment to moment. And then we learn just to surf or move easily and fluidly between the insight and the concentration sides of the practice, and you just end up getting both. But there's another, right, so I did say that quickly, but that's what we've been talking about here. Right? So you don't have to choose, am I doing concentration or insight? You just do your mindfulness of breathing, and you end up on both sides all the time. And you get both worlds. I think that happens probably for lots of people that way. But there's another thing in that style of practice that happens also. And this will make sense to any of you who either through retreats or in daily life have been able to get a certain level of concentration. And that is, isn't it true, I mean, I already know the answer, that say you come onto a retreat and you don't have much concentration in your daily life practice, just for example, very common. And so you come in the first few days of the retreat, you work the best you can, and you try to be present. And then within a certain amount of time, over a few days, your mind, it's amazing, it doesn't take that long, and your mind gets more concentrated. And isn't it true, once you've dropped more deeply into the meditation, that you're just naturally more aware of everything else going on in your body? You don't even have to necessarily try. It's just there. You know when something's going on in your body. You may still choose to incline the mind and investigate. We'll always have that sometimes. But a lot of times you're just doing mindfulness of breathing and something else in the body, it's known. When something's particularly pleasant or unpleasant, that's the second foundation on Vedana, you just know it. When mind states are arising, when you're more clear and deep in the meditation, it's just known. When you're on retreat and there's a sound or a particular, say it's a person that you see that you either really like or really don't like, that's the fetter that arises in that through that sense door. You know it. You know, oh, I'm having a lot of aversion or attraction. The whole four foundations of mindfulness gets laid out for you simply by doing a simple practice of mindfulness of breathing. So it's not a better way to view how to approach the four foundations of mindfulness, but it is one way, it's a different way. And in that style of practice then, it's especially a style of practice that brings the Samadhi aspect in with it more. Because by giving that emphasis on the breathing, again, when you're able to concentrate, you're able to take that deeper, and then there's all the other times when these other awarenesses come up. And You get both. And so the way I tend to practice is, rather than mindfulness being equated with insight and concentration being a different style of practice that has it's related but has its own goals and purposes, I see that the four foundations of mindfulness is the practice through which one gets right samadhi, through which one gets insight.
Say that again.
It's a different way to hold it.
Say that again.
The second way I'm talking?
Just what you just said, last sentence.
We put it together.
Oh yeah, let's see. Right. I said I think what I said, boy, that you can, I think a common way to understand insight is that mindfulness gets equated with insight. I think it gets talked about like that a lot. And then concentration is a different class or group of meditation practices. If you're doing concentration, it's not insight. And it has its own goals. It is still related, but it's different. You know, if you're doing concentration, you're not doing insight, right? And I'm approaching it from a different perspective. So this will be interesting when you see Lee and Tina and Stephen, because see, they'll come from a different place. I'm coming at it that mindfulness is the practice. Four foundations of mindfulness is the practice through which one attains right samadhi, through which one attains insight. So it's a different emphasis there. So it's bringing, it's all it's doing is you're keeping all of the insight parts. You're just bringing a little more emphasis on the concentration in with it. Different approach. It's actually not very different. All it does is just give a little more emphasis to breath. A little more prevalent. And by the way, there's just one moment, yeah. There's one more piece that's important. Along the way then, as the concentration deepens, we want to stay attuned to how the samadhi's unfolding, because if we go off into a Visuddhimagga style, then we really do need to come out of the jhana in order to have the insights, because you're more absorbed. Whereas in a sutta style, we can get the insights whether we're out of samadhi or even when we're in the jhana, the insights can be there. So it's just a different system. Yes, please.
Is there any reason, sometimes I look at the word right concentration and I try to understand why they would emphasize that so much. And so I'm gonna explain to you how I see it, and I'm curious to know if that has any value in my practice. So it's like people who do sports are highly concentrated, right? They're absolutely in tune with what they're doing. And one might even say they're mindful of every move that they make and so on and so forth. But because it's not, but that obviously is not the type of concentration. It's not when a pro baller goes up for a layup that he has this moment of insight, although he's completely focused. So in my mind, I try to discern between, there seems to be a group of people out there that have this immense capability to concentrate and focus. Is that wrong concentration, or is that just concentration that will not lead to insight?
Right. Well, I don't think they're thinking in terms of insight. If you think about, like, say, a basketball player, there's a particular kind of focus because there's a particular goal, which is to score in the game and prevent the opponent from scoring. So that's the purpose to which they're applying the mindfulness and the focus. And so if you go back to the Eightfold Path and this word that we call right view, on and on, right mindfulness, right concentration, that word right, it's fine as long as you understand it, but I think it was somewhat of we're stuck with it, but it was kind of an unfortunate translation. Because it has the connotation, well, there's a right and a wrong. But the word actually in Pali is samma. It's short A's, S-A-M-M-A, samma. So it's sammasati, right, samaditi, right view, sammasati, right mindfulness, Samadhi, right concentration. If you look up the word sama in the Polytext Society's Poly English Dictionary, it means to be connected in one with. Well, that's a beautiful feeling. What does it mean to be connected in one with? So it would be a view or a livelihood or an effort or a mindfulness or a concentration that's connected in one with what? Well, what's the goal? So the way I hold what's right or wrong in a Dharma context is different from how I would hold it in, say, a sports analogy, even though the analogy is a great analogy. It gets used a lot. Or for anything, what's the goal and the purpose, then what's right is right if you wanted to accomplish that goal. And so why did this particular system develop around Dharma practice? I can't say why, but I take it that this is what the Buddha or other, enlightened or, great masters had developed as what works. In other words, I think of it as it would be the right thing to do if you wanted to attain this result. That's the way. So it's not like a right or wrong. And so then what is the concentration, at least in this system, within Theravada Buddhism, where you could say the Pali tradition? What's the system? What would be the right, or the wise and skillful? What would one do if one wanted to gain that? And it's saying, well, you'd practice the 4 foundations of mindfulness. That would be the right thing to do from a mindfulness. And what's the concentration? You would develop the 4 jhanas. That's what the suttas are saying. Again, Sutimag has a different take. We'll get to that next time. Just one moment. I'll come back to you, but I think somebody else's hand was up first, and then I'll come to you, okay? Was that your hand that was up?
Oh, I did at one point, yeah.
Please, go ahead.
I think this is probably a longer topic, but in brief form, you say incline the mind. And if you're in a certain, say, balanced position during meditation, and you need to make a choice, you can incline the mind to achieve a certain goal. And I'm remembering some teachings that use the term analysis and not exploration.
Investigation.
But the warning has been, this is not like logical analysis. You're not bringing in other sources and comparing and all that. So
it's more experiential rather than thinking about it. Is that what you're saying?
I guess that's the intention in the meditation practice. So it's making a choice mentally, but it's not bringing in a lot of deep thinking. Is that the idea?
Well, yes, but it's actually not. I don't think in practice it's so simple, because no matter what techniques or style of practice we're doing, there's a number of aspects that are tools in our toolkit that we always have to have, depending on what's needed in a moment. So there will be the time, regardless of how much we emphasize the concentration side or not, there will always be the times when, first of all, just by being mindful of what's happening, the insights come. There's just more realizations. We see how we're creating suffering, or just we let go of our suffering or whatever. That's one part. When the concentration is deeper, that can be very profound because it has the support of the Samadhi. So on one hand, we don't have to go do any investigations at all. There's just a place where these insights come just as a result of being mindful with right concentration. Okay, there's that piece. But even if we're emphasizing that, there will always be times when we may it's our intuition, we just choose to actually do some active investigation. That's just what we feel is needed. And so we're always going to there might be times when we need to do that. And that can take a number of forms. So yes, the way it's traditionally talked about, it's not thinking about something, it's more directing our awareness to connect with experience on a different way. We feel more deeply into what's happening, or we perceive on more subtler levels, and that's not a verbal thinking about it. And so we could say a lot more about that. So there's all of that. However, I think we don't want to overdo the thinking for sure, so we want to be careful, but I think that there are plenty of times we don't want to throw out any place that thinks something through. Sometimes in order to untangle something, it may serve us to bring in the verbal or think something through. And that's typically not talked about at all as part of Vipassana in general, I would say. However, I think most people would agree that, again, most of us, the problem is we use the think it through way too much. So maybe we want to be careful about talking about it because we're already overdoing it. But I think there could be a time when, and so how do you know? Put it into practice and see what happens. That's all you have to do. Any of these practices, it doesn't matter who the teacher is, what the style is, if you're drawn to it, or in a moment if you have an intuition to try something out, as long as you're staying attuned to what the result is, the best you can, and don't worry about your blind spots. You can't see your blind spots. And you see what happens. Is it helping you let go of your suffering? Is it leading to more of an open heart and a quiet mind and an equanimity? Is it creating more difficulty, whatever? And is it helping you or not? Try it out. And the worst that'll happen is you ended up overthinking something for a while when really it would have served you not to, and so, okay, you learned. Yeah.
I wanted to comment about the basketball player, that it strikes me that this basketball player had developed some degree of a kind of concentration and embodied presence that would help her develop mindfulness and meditation should we decide to do it. It seems like it, that it's a kind of concentration that could be applied. And the other thing I was noticing on page 6 is how in the sutras and in common sense, mindfulness supports concentration, and concentration supports mindfulness.
Right.
That is, it somehow in common sense, you need a degree of mindfulness to concentrate, and a degree of concentration to be mindful.
Right. In practice, they're kind
of both.
Right. In practice, mindfulness and concentration actually cannot be completely separated out. If you want to practice concentration, if you think that's your emphasis, then you have to bring in the mindfulness and the insight and the wisdom to know what's happening, how to work skillfully. You need to be mindful of when there's hindrances and what's working. So you have to bring in the mindfulness side to strengthen concentration. If you strengthen concentration and you're focusing on that, it naturally leads to more of a clarity of mindfulness because you have a presence and your mind's more clearly. So they each support each other, and I think that's absolutely true. And so then it's just a question of different approaches may make a conscious emphasis on wanting to on one side or the other, but you end up with both. But having said that, if you think, say, jhana is important, there are ways of practicing that just aren't going to, they might give you tremendous insight and liberation and wisdom, but they're not going to lead to that kind of samadhi. And conversely, if you can develop kinds of samadhi that actually don't lead to, that could be almost trance-like states that don't lead to more insight. So you can practice also in ways that, you can practice in ways that support each other, and you can practice in ways that don't support each other too, depending on the emphasis. And it's one of the reasons we want to really be exposed, as we're trying to do here, to the range of ways that samadhi not only is taught and understood, but in practice, how it can unfold and manifest, so we can be aware, because there's a lot, so we can know, where do I want to head? Oh, what's actually happening? Do I want to go with that, or do I want to steer it in a different direction? Just one moment, Bob, because I think, wait a minute. Okay, yes, please.
I just want to reiterate and see if I'm understanding something correctly. But first of all, I wanted to mention, like, there's a lot of investigation involved in the practices, the practice of the foundations of mindfulness and the subject. So that there's a tremendous amount of investigation
Right.
going on. So the 4 foundations of mindfulness lead to right samadhi, lead to right concentration. And you mentioned sama, right, as being to be connected at one with, which to me corresponds back to that unification of mind, and then the calm, the actual not complete, but the calming of the nervous system,
Yeah.
tranquility, everything really does have to do with the right samadhi. And then the insights can do arise quite naturally from that concentrated state.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. Yeah, thank you.
Two questions. In one of your interviews, I think one of the gems was, I forget who said this, but you were talking about this topic that we're talking about right now, and he said something like, look, the Buddha never said practice vipassana. He said practice jhana.
That was Lee Brasington who said
was
that.
Lee, okay.
Right.
And then out of that, both the concentration and the insight.
Right.
And so I guess my question is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure. Well, look, if you it's hard to, I don't see how you can avoid how much emphasis in the suttas that the Buddha put on jhana. It's just, he's just putting it in your face all over the place in there. So it's hard to get away from that in there. However, there are also places in the suttas, like you can, if you take the Satipatthana Sutta on its own terms, you kind of pop it out of the suttas, you can legitimately practice it and understand it and approach it without that. Now, one thing I'll just add in that's this little complication is some scholars think that it's pretty clear that the Satipatthana Sutta was a later development, and that came more out of the commentarial understanding, which, remember, that's what led to the Suddhimagga, which was starting to emphasize the insight separated somewhat from the samadhi side, or emphasized more over the samadhi. And it was a different emphasis. I don't know if we can really know for sure, but if that happened, you can see that even within the suttas, it started to pull the emphasis in a little different direction. In any case, what we're left with today then is, we've got a Visuddhimagga that's, it's not fuzzy like the suttas. They got very clear and explicit. The suttas is, it's open. You can find canonical evidence to support any view. So again, if you hold it as a whole, I don't know how people de-emphasize jhana. And it'd be interesting if someone who was coming from that perspective were here, have them answer that exact question, and to see what that person might say would be, I think it'd be interesting, an interesting conversation.
The other thing?
Yeah.
Just going back to Veda, when you talked about it before, you kind of focused on the pleasant, unpleasant, neutral part. Again, this is kind of coming out of my Goenka retreats, that his whole system, I think, revolves around that one. almost.
Right, he does.
And it's all focusing, I mean, he says, yes, it's pleasant, unpleasant, and that's all there. But what's important is the experience of the sensations.
Right.
And yes, they're pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. But it's kind of like that's an after effect, but it's really being in tune with the sensations as you scan the body.
Yeah.
And he has a whole structure built on that. So my question is that, I don't think that conflicts with what you're saying. It's just
No.
shining the light on a different part of it. So do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that. Yeah. And I think he's explicit that he's focusing on the second foundation of mindfulness. That's his emphasis. Yes, please.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure where, I'd like to bring you back,
Okay.
because I don't understand.
Whatever, go please.
Page 7? I don't know where you are.
Well, we're not in the, we're just doing Q&A.
Right, right, I don't know where you were. But, 1, 2, 3, 4, I guess about 6 paragraph, when contemplating the 4 foundations, if discomfort in the body. So I don't understand. I understand the discomfort and the sluggishness and the distraction. But what I don't understand is inspiring sign. One should direct the mind towards some inspiring sign.
Right, it doesn't define that here. So this was just an example of,
Is that from the sutras? It's not.
well, this is just a place that's, yes, it's there from the Samyutta Nikaya. She's talking about in the middle of page 7. Well, let's just go to that for a moment. Well, I put that in there because it's just there's many, many places that pretty directly tie 4 foundations of mindfulness in with Samadhi in other places in the sutta. So this is just another example. I just put a bunch in there. And what it's just giving you a tip on how to practice, some suggestion.
What do you mean by inspiring sign?
Well, something that, well, it doesn't define it here, so I'm just giving you mine. Right, it's something that, let's just give an example. If it's, what is it that can help gladden your mind if you're having a difficulty, right? So what is it that can, maybe it's turning your mind instead of, so if you're struggling, it's telling you if you're some difficulty in your body, and maybe you're struggling to be with what's going on. And your mind is contracted. And maybe we've tried the technique of put your attention just onto what's happening, be with it, whatever. Maybe that's not working. You're not able to let go. So we need some help. So then sometimes we need to find, well, what can help me get my mind in a place that can be more able to work with what's happening. So these are just tools that it's offering us. And so then it's saying you just move, you put your mind toward, it's not telling us what that means here. So you can interpret it however you want, right? Because let's see where it's leading, and then that will help inform. Direct the mind, so it's really saying away from the difficulty towards an inspiring sign. Don't know what that is yet. When the mind is directed toward an inspiring sign, gladness is born. When glad and rapture is born, we're going to come back to inspiring sign in a moment. The body of one who is rapturous is tranquil. So we've popped ourselves out of struggle. One whose body is tranquil feels happiness. The mind of one who's happy becomes concentrated, and so on. So it's talking about a way of working when you're doing 4 foundations of mindfulness practice. It's very explicit. And it's tying it into a time, at least, when we would want to bring in some samadhi elements. So then the question is, what is it that can help turn the mind in that way? So I could think of a number of ways. For example, let's just say a difficulty of, well, here it's talking about in the body, right? Or distraction, right? But let me just name it's hard to give it just a general, but I'm just going to throw a few out to sort of prime the pump for you. Sometimes if we're having a hard time, you could reflect, for example, on your own sincere intention. And you could feel that even though you're struggling and my body hurts and I can't be with this knee pain, then what am I going to do? Just as an example, you could feel into what's my intention. Wow, I've been working, and I've shown up here. I've been doing every sit all day. I'm working hard. I have a good intention. It feels like it's just knocking me around, but actually, what's my intention? And maybe that gladdens your mind. So, I'm really here trying to do this work. And maybe your mind relaxes a little. Now it's a little more relaxed, a little glad, and maybe it can lead down, or whatever.
So I go to loving kindness.
There you go. There's your answer, loving kindness.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought maybe it was like,
Oh, you don't have to visualize. Well, I don't know. It's whatever works. There's no limit here.
what?
Kittens.
Kittens.
Kittens or visualize the Buddha or whatever. So I'm wanting us to, well, here's what I want to do. I want to look at the Anapanasati Sutta, but it's going to be quick. And then I'm going to ask us to take a short break. And I already noticed some people are leaving, and so we're going to take a short break. It's getting later in the afternoon. We'll come back and do an ending sit and closing. Yeah. So let's just, I just am saying that to help gladden your mind if you're tired. Because, this is a lot of, it's a lot of words here. Then, and remember, when we actually go into practice, you just put all this stuff down. It's meant to help inform, and then whatever is there that can help you will be there. And what you don't try to remember all this. It's right. So this is just to. How you doing, Elizabeth? Yeah. So just if you have a choice, either be present moment by moment to whatever's arising, or just stay with your mindfulness of breathing and let that unfold. There's two ways to approach it. And then everything else is just... Anapanasati Sutta, for those of you whose brains are still working, we'll do this quickly. Is a little different. First of all, it says in that sutta that just by doing this mindfulness of breathing practice, that fulfills the whole four foundations of mindfulness. Actually, that's giving us a clue that just through mindfulness, it's kind of actually what I was just talking about is one possible among many possible ways to approach the sutta. Here's a sutta is actually saying, it's not saying it's the only way. And again, emphasizing that by fulfilling the four foundations of mindfulness, it fulfills the seven factors of enlightenment. Okay. And basically what this does, it's an interesting structure. It's divided into 16 steps. These lists like this just go on and on. And a lot of it is just pedagogical. They were aids for memorization, and it's just, And the lists are there on page 8 and 9 in your notes. And it's 4 groups of 4, so 4 tetrads. Let me just say something quickly about these. The first tetrad is the identical practices from the Satipatthana Sutta. You're mindful of, if it's a long breath, you're mindful of a short breath. You're being with your breathing. You experience your whole body and you tranquilize the bodily formation. And then you can see the next one. As you keep going, you experience piti, you experience sukha, that's the rapture and pleasure. And then the mental formation, so it's getting subtler and you're going to tranquilize. So this is sankharas. We just don't have time. That's a big topic of what is it actually asking us to tranquilize? Is it all mental activity? Is it just the part of mental activity that's create suffering? There's a lot of different ways you could understand because the term of mental formations. But anyway, I'm going to leave. We just can't do it all here. But it's just a list here. And then the fourth tetrad, you experience and gladden and concentrate the mind. Chitta is the word in the third tetrad. And then the fourth tetrad is contemplating impermanence, dispassion, cessation, and letting go. Okay. Really, all I want to say about this sutta is that it is taught and understood as being the last tetrad is clearly on the insight side. Impermanence, dispassion, There's no question about that. But the first 3 tetrads leading up to it, there's just a huge range of ways it's understood and put into practice. If you read Larry Rosenberg's book, that's an older book called Breath by Breath, it's on this, and it's very much, he's not emphasizing the concentration aspect at all. It's really much pretty much the whole thing is a insight emphasis through this. And for others, it's very much, some people will go the other extreme. You've got to have jhana, they'll say. I'm kind of in the middle. I don't think you can get away for some degree of samadhi here with this tranquilizing that's happening. There's no question in my mind. And especially since it fulfills the 4 foundational mindfulness, which fills the 7 factors of enlightenment, which, I think just maps onto jhana from my interpretation. I think there's a lot of samadhi here. But I also often say, there's no gotta get. Like, you don't have to have samadhi, you've got whatever you got. So this is one, the sutta's open to really a wide range of approaches. In the service of jhana, there's no question that that's a whole model that can fit here. It goes right back to what we're saying before. You just start working with mindfulness of breathing, and you can see that these 16 steps naturally follow. They become fruits of mindfulness of breathing meditation. You could do it that way. You can also consciously work from one step to another, is another way some people do it. Okay, I've done step 6. I think I've pretty much got it. Now I'm going to turn my mind to step 7. Lots of different approaches. Just like in the Satipatthana Sutta, you could let it naturally unfold, or you could incline your mind towards one aspect or the other. Yeah. I'm sorry we didn't manage the time any better today, because this sutta could use a little more exploration. Just one moment, yes.
At a quick glance, I just made this comparison of these tetrads, like the first 2, the first and the second, as related to all those investigations of the Satipatthana Sutta, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and the third is right concentration, and the fourth, and then the fourth tetrad on the inside side.
Good. Well, so that's an interesting way to hold it. Did you guys all hear that? Do I need to repeat it? Yeah. But that maps it back more to the way of holding it, that 4 foundations of mindfulness is the practice that leads to right concentration, through which you get insight. Right. So it maps beautifully onto that particular way of approaching it. It does. And again, not the only way to hold it, but it's certainly, for those of you who care about samadhi, this sutta just flows very nicely. And also, the sutta says, by the way, that each tetrad, so the first tetrad fulfills the first foundation of mindfulness, the second tetrad the second, and so on through the 4. And I think some of that correlation is clear. Some of the correlations maybe not as clear, but that's what depends on, second foundation. But, well, actually, I think it can map nicely too. So, different ways it's understood. Oh, yes, sorry, yes.
The difference between 15 and 16. Trains contemplating cessation and trains contemplating letting go.
Right.
What's the difference?
Right. So I don't want to, I'll just say this briefly, and then we can talk offline about, because we just don't have time to get into the sutta so much. But remember, it's a cessation of what? So I think the way I hold this nirodha, it's not a cessation of where all experience is a cessation of phenomena. I see it as a cessation of suffering, you could say, or a cessation of, because it goes back to when we tranquilize mental formations. See, this is, if you think about that as an aspect of sankharas, and a particular aspect which is mental form fabrications, which is that aspect that's sort of where we create a suffering, we take raw experience and build it into something. That aspect, which you could call concoctions or fabrications, I see that as a cessation of that, is the way I take it. In that way, by contemplating impermanence, we have this dispassion, which is also sometimes called a non-attachment. I got some other definitions here. A fading away, a non-detachment. And through that, then, we still can be human beings, so we still are functioning, but there's a nirodha, there's a cessation of, you could say, suffering. This takes us right back to the Four Noble Truths. And then through that, there's a letting go of, it's a non-clinging. And it takes us to the liberation through non-clinging. I hope that's quick, but that would be my take on it. So we're going to wrap, yes, no, it's okay. I just want to, yeah.
In terms of the value of concentration and wise concentration, it seems to me, if you look at the Buddhism, the goal is the end of suffering, and there's obviously a huge emphasis placed on awareness of the present moment. It seems to me that the concentration is like an anchor. Like without the concentration, I don't think one could really stay with the present moment.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that resonates with you.
Well, it does. And when I hear that, you're saying without the concentration, it's hard to stay with, you can't stay with the present moment. I think a perfect example is, like, it's common to hear people say, for example, that they want to take on a practice of mindfulness in daily life, where as much as you can remember, you want to be present with whatever's happening. And a beautiful, deep practice, right, to do that. So you try to be mindful when you're cooking food, when you're driving your car, maybe you feel your hands on the steering wheel as an anchor in the present moment, or when you're walking around at work, you feel your feet, whatever you want to. If you've ever tried that, and if you've ever had an experience, and sincere practice, and then you say, okay, I'm going to do it, and then 8 hours later you wake up and remember, oh yeah, I was trying to be mindful. That's an example of mindfulness without the support of the concentration.
Right, exactly.
It's good practice when you can remember, but when you've got the stability of the samadhi, your natural presence, it's just a whole different level. And that's not negating it. When I say whole different level, I'm not in any way negating mindfulness without the samadhi support. But it's just something different. I'm not saying better or worse. And so then, when we take it even further to jhana, we're just taking that exact same idea, at least when we're talking about sutta jhana, where you're still connected with experience. We just take it even further. The level of steadiness and clarity is on a whole even other level. And we can see how much we really can see and perceive on subtler and subtler levels. That's the whole point as far as I can see. Now, I do think that these meditative states, I would say, have their own benefits that's maybe not in service of liberation. For example, there's a lot of healing that can come through samadhi, and it can be restful and restorative, and a lot of its own benefits too. But certainly in the service of liberation, it seems. I think, as far as I can tell, that's why, going back to why is jhana called, right concentration called jhana? I think it's because of that support.